October collapsed amid allegations of asset stripping. The dispute moved into the courts, and for much of the following decade, control of Ajaokuta became tangled in a web of Nigerian and Indian companies, legal battles, and competing claims over ownership. But while the paperwork changed hands, the steel mill remained largely silent, and the railway line connecting Ajaokuta to the iron ore mines at Itakpe, it still wasn't running. After decades of promises, billions spent, and countless attempts to revive the project, Ajaokuta remained what it had always threatened to become, a monument to what Nigeria had hoped to build and what it never More than $10 billion had been spent on Ajaokuta since 1979, a staggering figure, larger than the investment behind some entire steel industries elsewhere in Africa. But the real cost went beyond the money. Engineers who had once trained there, preparing for the day the plant would finally begin operating, found themselves looking elsewhere for opportunities. Many of them eventually